Hello, BookTube. Well, it's the 1st of November, and you know what that means. It means the start of two big events in the writing and reading world. In the writing world, of course, this is the beginning of NaNoWriMo, National Novel Writing Month, in which a whole bunch of people get together and write the beginning of a novel in the course of November. An insane endeavor that is so much fun. But I'll make NaNoWriMo, I'll make AuthorTube videos about NaNoWriMo on my own. The other event, a big event here on BookTube that don't get much bigger, is Nonfiction November, which is 5 years old and was created by Olive at a Book Olive, and which is designed to encourage you to read more nonfiction, to read more if you read some, to read some if you read none. It's designed to celebrate nonfiction on BookTube, which, BookTube had its origins mostly in the world of YA and has never ventured far from fiction. The fields of nonfiction on BookTube are fairly thin. Even now, after all this time, when I believe that BookTube's multiplicity has increased to almost the level of the multiplicity of readers who are out there, which is the ideal thing that we want BookTube to be. We want BookTube to look just like the totally unpredictable, incredibly infinite variety of readers who are out there. I imagine we'll just barely reach that perfect realization when we are shut down. But in the meantime, to celebrate the kickoff of Nonfiction November, Olive made a tag, and I love it, of course, and I want to do it on this channel as well. I'm sure you'll see it on her channel. This is the Nonfiction on BookTube tag, and it's designed to sort of take a preliminary overview of your relationship both to nonfiction and to nonfiction on BookTube, kind of like a nonfiction version of the BookTube newbie tag. So let's commence with the questions right away, because they're all really, really good, as you would expect from an Olive tag. The first one is simple: how much nonfiction do you read? And if we're going to quantify that on a scale of 100%, I would say under normal circumstances I read about 80% nonfiction. And then I try intentionally to keep that other 20% locked in, or maybe even go above that, just because I know my own tendency. My own tendency is to read nothing but nonfiction, and if I did that, I would miss out on a lot. I know I'm the harshest critic of the made-up stories, but they can move me. They can delight me. They can make me think. They can do all the stuff that people who love fiction love it for. So ordinarily it's 80%. In Nonfiction November, that number goes up to 98%, but still leaves room for fiction. There is still room for fiction. Not in November, but I mean, the only fiction that I'll be reading in November is fiction that I am contractually obligated to do. So I have a couple of read-alongs on this channel, for instance, that I'm not, after consideration, going to abandon. I also, if I'm being paid to review a work of fiction, then that as well. But that's a tiny fraction, and all the rest of it, all the elective stuff, I'm just going to skip that until December. So I'm going to concentrate on nonfiction in this month. Question number 2: what kinds of nonfiction videos do you make or want to make on BookTube? A great deal of my content is nonfiction or nonfiction related in one way or another, because I'm giving you recommendations, and we're also going through my mail, and my mail reflects my reading. To a very large extent, it reflects my reading. So there's quite a bit of nonfiction there. You see a lot on this channel. You see ahead of time a lot of the major publishing nonfiction that's going to come down the pike in your bookstore. In a more specialized sense, the nonfiction videos that I used to make on this channel, and I really need to make again, I really need to make just a personal commitment to do this in 2020, would be all of my topic heavy things, my presidential library series, where I go through each president through their books, or starter kits, which you all love and which I have more or less abandoned. I haven't done a starter kit in forever, and I mean to do that. I mean to do that on a systematic basis in 2020. But before then, you should keep your eye out for some starter kits specifically connected with Nonfiction November. But I know that I have been remiss in things like that, and there are a whole bunch of other things like that I could come up with. So those more themed things would be my answer. Question number 3: what's your favorite subgenre of nonfiction? And there are an infinite variety of them. This is one of the key points that I like to make to people about nonfiction, is that It has easily as much variety as fiction, easily as much. I would maintain that it has hundreds of times more, and that it couldn't help but have hundreds of times more variety than fiction. But in my own case, my favorite nonfiction is biography, and there's a subdivision even of biography. I really like really big biographies, the kind of biography that I can lose myself in, something that's over 800 pages, where I can just sort of, that feeling, I know you know the feeling I'm talking about, where you just lose yourself in a book, where it becomes not so much a bus ride as a swim in a pool. And I don't ordinarily get that feeling when I read a book. They're mostly all bus rides for me, and that is mainly because I read very fast. I read an average of 150 pages an hour. So there isn't time for me. You need time. Time has to be an element in wallowing in a book like that, and I don't usually get that. And if a book is 800 pages or more, then I do. And also, I kind of like it I mean, I'm all in favor of a witty, very epigrammatic biography, definitely, and I have a whole stack of them that I love here in Hyde Cottage. But I'm all in favor of a biography that's sort of opulent with detail, that is free to go into digressions, that is free to give you the atmosphere and the street names and the minor rituals, as well as the key bullet points. I like that in a biography, and you don't usually get that in something that's 300 pages long. So my favorite kind of nonfiction is biography, and my favorite kind of sub kind of nonfiction is long biographies, big fat biographies. Question number 4: do you have a favorite nonfiction book? A killer question, and one that caused me to go into the little book room and just sort of wander around looking at the shelves, because it's almost impossible, right? One favorite nonfiction book. You read nonfiction in different moods for different reasons. I think I have come up with a provisional favorite, something certainly that I've gone to more often than any other in recent years, and that is The Diary of Samuel Pepys. It was a Restoration naval official and a man about town, a rising man about town, and an ardent aficionado of music and books and book collecting. And he kept a journal for 10 years. He kept a journal. Didn't always do it religiously every day. All of you who keep journals will know. Sometimes he would backdate entries. He would finally be able to sit down relatively sober on a Sunday afternoon, and he would realize he hadn't made an entry since Friday, and he would make an entry for Friday, and an entry for Saturday, and then an entry for Sunday. Some of the entries are very short. Some of them are very, receipt-minded. He was very into money. He was very interested in what he owed and what he earned and what he possessed. But others are much richer in what he was doing and how he did it, of who he met and what they talked about and where and when. And all of it is so marvelously unself-conscious. He is definitely not writing for an audience of any kind, even himself. That it just takes you out. For me, it just takes me completely out of myself. So I'm going to say that my number one favorite is The Diary of Samuel Pepys, but there are so many other favorites. I'll stick to that just because the question calls for it. But question number 5: what do you think keeps people from wanting to read more nonfiction? Here, I think the answer is bad public relations, bad PR. Nonfiction is billed as boring, as dutiful, as dry, and it partially receives help in that billing because it is what is drilled into you in school, alongside your one English class, which has mandatory reading. I am against mandatory reading of all kinds. No one should be forced to read Romeo and Juliet. That is just sacrilege. But that's only one class. Whereas it's surrounded on all sides of your high school and college curriculum by lots of other classes that are forcing you to read nonfiction. That creates a stigma. You can't help but associate the reading material with all of the negative stuff around it. And that's enhanced in the adult world, where a normal adult doesn't read anything ever in the course of a year. An abnormal adult, an extremely brainy adult, reads maybe one book a year, maybe 2 books a year. And you will sometimes see very, very ambitious dude bro YouTubers, young male YouTubers who will say, I read 1 book a month, for a year, I just made myself do it. I sat down and made myself do it, and it changed my life. And they're always reading nonfiction. But most people, when you talk about their reading, will say, "Well, yeah, I love novels. I love YA, but oh, I don't want to read history. Am I back in school?" I've heard that so many times. Am I back in school? And that's bad PR. That's not people who have sampled it and come away with that conclusion. That's people who are reciting the given wisdom of the thing, and doing it without knowing that they're slighting a genre they would end up loving, a kind of writing they would end up loving. So I think it's bad PR. I don't think it has anything to do with that's what keeps people from reading more of it, is just what they think they know about it, but they're wrong. They are very much wrong. In the course of this Nonfiction November, we will show you that you're wrong if you happen to think that way. Question number 6 is, why do you like nonfiction? And believe it or not, my answer is because of how interactive it is, which seems counterintuitive. People automatically assume that fiction is more interactive because you're directly identifying with the characters, and there are characters, and anything can happen, and the plots are wide open, and it feels participatory, not just because of all those things, but because in the back of your mind you're thinking, I could do this. I think that was the ultimate genesis of NaNoWriMo, is that people think, they read fiction and think, well, anybody can tell a story. All the rest of it is just a matter of skill, whereas you read a work of nonfiction and you think, oh, well, I can't do this. This person has X, Y, and Z credentials. They have a long resume. They have all this sort of extra training, and that is why they can write this book. But and that means I might enjoy it, but I can't do it myself. And that, on the surface, might make it look less participatory. But I believe that nonfiction is actually more interactive than fiction, because fiction just is what it is, and you can't do anything about it. The most you can do is catch an author in an inconsistency in book 5 of a series. Whoop-de-doo. So you go to a discussion board online and crow about that for a minute and realize that 50 people found it before you. But with nonfiction, the more you know the subject, the more you realize that all that talk about credentials and expertise was largely window dressing. The more you know a subject, really know it, the more you dig into a subject, the more capable you are of seeing what that author is doing with the same information that you read. That is extremely interactive. All of a sudden, you're involved. It's like if somebody wrote a book about your high school years. Which would you rather read? This is the thing that I always say to people. If you had a choice to read a stranger's novel about some made-up character's high school years, or a stranger's nonfiction account of your high school years, which would you read? There isn't a single person in the world, no matter what they think of nonfiction, who wouldn't instantly pick the second one. Because they are directly involved. Well, you get that directly involved the more you know about whatever the nonfiction subject is that you're reading about. Right? So if you don't know anything about the subway system in New York, and you start to study it, watch YouTube videos, read some books about it, talk to people, maybe take a tour. There are plenty of historical tours. And you start to amass this thing. And from these various sources, you start to pick out similarities. You start to think, okay, a narrative is forming in my mind. And some of it is interesting, and more interesting than others, and some characters are more interesting than others. And then somebody writes a book about the New York subway system. You are more involved in that book than you could ever be in a novel that kind of sort of featured the New York subway system, but there was also about, a shop clerk meeting a disguised princess, or whatever nonsense it is. Or, I'm sorry, I should mention lighthouse keepers, because they feature in the made-up stories a lot. You're going to be much more involved once you know a little of that subject, and we're going to get to that later on here. But that's the reason why I like nonfiction, is because either an author is inviting me to learn more about a subject about which I know nothing, or an author is moving around chess pieces of a subject that I already know about. And that makes it inherently fascinating for me to find out what they're doing, and do I agree with it, and do I not, and why. Anyway, question number 7, what's a nonfiction book you read because of BookTube? And for me, there's not much that I've read because of BookTube. There's plenty that I've reread because of BookTube. I mentioned this on this channel before. You read a book, you chuck it into the memory hole, and then years and years later, you have been following a BookTuber, you know, for many, many videos, and to the point where you get to quote unquote know them. You get to know how they read. You get to know where and how you disagree with them and agree with them. You get to know, in other words, whether or not you trust them. It doesn't matter whether you agree with them all the time. You get to know whether or not you trust their bookish judgment, which is quite a different thing from them reading things that you would read or taking their recommendations. And once you come to trust somebody's bookish judgment, whether it takes a little time or a long time, you can't get rid of that. You can't just say, well, I trusted your bookish judgment yesterday when you were talking about this, but I don't trust your bookish judgment today when you're talking about that. You can't do that. That's the wonderful thing about it, is that you suddenly have to reassess something. Now, sometimes some of those things are tougher orders than others. For instance, there's a large group of booktubers channels I absolutely love who are still dude-brodishly, adolescently fascinated with the crappy fiction of William Faulkner, for instance, or Cormac McCarthy. And I can trust them as readers and still ignore that nonsense because I know that they are not examining their affection for those authors, not the way they examine something that's completely new. I've seen it happen so many times. What they are doing is colloquially known as moving the goalposts. So you give them a completely total stranger of an author writing wordy, posturing prose about the American South. They're going to be the first people to say, well, this author's pretty impressed with himself, isn't he? And where do these characters come from? And why do they talk like comic book figures when they're actually real people? And why don't they seem to have through A, B to C motivation lines like ordinary people? Why does it seem so much like their characters not only in a novel but in a bad melodrama? You give them a new piece of writing that does all that crap, and they're going to be the first people to jump all over it and do it in very insightful and entertaining ways. And that's why I trust them as readers. The fact that they absolutely don't do that with charlatans like Cormac McCarthy or William Faulkner is, and also the look on their face and the sound in their voice when they start to talk about these exceptions is proof positive for me that they move the goalposts. The only difference between them and me is that when I move the goalposts, I make sure to tell you ahead of time. I know that I'm doing it. It's not some holdover from when I was in high school and I thought reading was like a video game and it was just so cool, man. It's not any holdover from that. I re-examine my reading on a vigorous level every year. So when I tell you that I have a penchant for novels about giant prehistoric killer sharks, I'm telling you that for those novels I move the goalposts. I'm not telling you that because I like them they must be good, or that because I liked them 30 years ago my critical judgment must still be checked at the door. Anyway, my point is, once you get to know someone's as a reader and trust their judgment as a reader, if a book comes up on their channel and they're saying, I just read this and I thought it was all kinds of excellent. I've had this happen so many times on BookTube where I will hear that and I will think, okay, well, I read that book and I don't remember it being that good, but now I have to reread it. Plain and simple. Now I have to reread it. Because the whole reason we're in this reading game is to question our own judgments. So I will find. It's a perfect example. This thing, The Devil's Broker, book about condottieri, about armed mercenaries during the Italian Renaissance. I saw Jason Harrigan was reading it in the course of a month. He was a new booktuber to me, but I'd had more than enough time to respect his judgment as a reader, and he was reading it and really liking it. Next time I came across it, I grabbed it to reread it, and I'm glad I did because there was a lot more going on than I remembered. So when it comes to this question, there's nothing that I can call off the top of my head that I've read because of BookTube that's nonfiction, but there's plenty of nonfiction that I've revisited because of BookTube, often to my great delight. Let's see here. Question number 8. What's the best nonfiction you've read lately? Yeah, that's a question, isn't it? Well, I want to stress once again on this channel that in only a month, you're going to learn what the best nonfiction that I've read lately is, because at the end of every year, I do an extensive year-end roundup, far more extensive than the year-end roundups that you will see in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, And all of it derived from my own immediate personal reading. I'm in December. I will be running down the best and worst books of 2019, and there's like 16 categories, and a great many of them are nonfiction. And there you will learn the best biographies that I read in 2019, the best general nonfiction, the best science, the best nature, the best history. You will learn all of that in December. Question number 9: what are some of your nonfiction reading goals? I actually do have nonfiction reading goals for 2020. They're not carved in stone. I don't make any plans that cross the Terminator from one year to the next. I might not read books at all in 2020. I might not be here to tell you about it in 2020 if I do. And if I do, I might not read new releases. There are no givens. There are no holdovers. There's no momentum. So, but I can dream in 2019, especially at the end of 2019. And of course, if 2020 is like 2019, then one of my goals for 2020 will be to read every new release in the American book market in those categories that I mentioned. There are about 16 or 17, about 20 categories of books that I read. Debut fiction, works in translation, science fiction, fantasy, mystery, kids' picture books, YA, romance, fiction, general interest, nonfiction, science, nature, history, biography, military history. There's a list, and my goal theoretically for 2020 would be to read every major new release in all of those categories. I don't have a job. I scarcely ever indulge in social company or personal hygiene, and I don't do anything else. It's all I do. So I don't think that's an unreasonable goal. I will be working towards that. I am certainly closing in on doing that for 2019. With a couple of egregious exceptions, but I'm looking to take care of it all by the end of the year. Let's see here. Question number 10. Really the real one, the real biggie. What's your advice for incorporating more nonfiction into your reading diet? That's going to be a question a lot of people have when they look at Nonfiction November. They're going to say, well, I'd like to do that, but where on earth do I start? Long before there was a BookTube, long before there was most of you, I was getting that question from people. Would come up to me and say, well, I know you love nonfiction and I want to read more of it. It always satisfies me more in different ways than fiction does, but I have no idea where to start. It's intimidating. And I agree. I agree that it is. And my advice is always the same. Start small. Get a patch of ground solidly under your feet, and then take another step to an immediately adjacent patch. Get that under your feet, and then take another step. You can do that with any kind of subject. The one kind of subject that I would probably discourage you from doing that with is, unfortunately, the kind of subject that is most popular for that approach, which is the personal genealogy of your own family. And the only reason I would discourage you is because that is, to me, has the highest likelihood of becoming a cul-de-sac, a dead end. A great number of people I know who started feeding their interest in nonfiction by learning about their own family tree stopped there. They stopped by just obsessing about that, and they don't learn about anything else. It's the one kind of nonfiction inquiry that seems dangerous to me because it's so solipsistic, so that it has an end goal in mind and it has limitations. You don't want your subject to have limitations. The limitation should ultimately be the history of the world. And you would think that might be true for personal genealogies, but it never is. Not in my experience anyway, it never is. People just obsessively learn more and more and more about their own family tree, and they aren't interested even in the world of those people. Just, can I find another record? Can I link these two people? That sort of thing. So aside from that, that is the only exception. Pick any other subject, something that interests you. A battle, a person, a disease, an invention, something like that. Pick something like that. The most familiar route is usually a person. No matter how bad your historical primary school education was, and if you're an American, it was virtually non-existent, it was so bad, some character from history will jump out at you somehow. Somehow they will. Whether it's through a TV show or a Broadway musical, or the fact that you have the same name. Oh my God, that happens so much more often than you would like. Look at critical biographies of major figures in history, and keep an eye out from time to time for how many times the subject of the biography has the same first name, the first Christian name, as the biographer. I'm telling you, that happens more often than you would think, and there's nothing wrong with that. No starting point. All starting points are silly. Just ask a baby. So what you want to do is pick a small patch and learn that patch. Really learn it to the point where you can reel it off, where to the point where you know it, where you know that patch really well. No matter how small it is. Say it's I don't even know. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Say it's the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Say that you have a grandparent who remembers watching it on TV, and their stories always fascinated you, so you decide you want to study the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. So you start with the basics. You go to Wikipedia. You start with the overviews. Then you dig in a little deeper. You realize that some of the people who were there wrote memoirs, and in those memoirs there are chapters about what happened. That a lot of the people who were professionals who helped to film it and organize it also have accounts in diaries that have been published, in letters that have been published. Sooner or later, you will realize that the only way any of us knows anything about events in the past is because of stuff like that. When you read stuff like that, one on top of another, you are amassing a primary source bibliography. That's a hoity-toity way to put it, but you're doing what any historian would do. And that's a start. That's a completely legitimate start. If you were to do that on, say, for instance, the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, not only would it be fun to do, just do that process would be fun, but in less than a year, you would know as much about that subject as any specialist in the world. Isn't that amazing? That is amazing. And you can move on from there. Of course you will. You'll move on from there. Maybe to Elizabeth II just in general. Okay, well, now I know about her coronation. What about her youth before she came to the throne? And maybe that leads to learning about her father. There's a whole bookcase full of biographies about her father. Maybe you want to learn more about him. Read those biographies and realize, when you're reading those biographies, make a point of looking at their bibliographies. What sources did they consult? You'll start to notice a lot of the same books crop up. Maybe you'll even read some of those books. Then you do the same thing. You go to those books and look at their bibliographies. Where did they consult? Where did all these things come from? It's possible to do that, and there is no man behind the curtain. The more you do that with nonfiction, the more you get involved like that from the little patch where you started from, the more you realize how interactive this is. You can start to do it yourself. So my advice for starting nonfiction would be start small. Pick something that interests you. The coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, the passing of the U.S. amendment that gave women the right to vote, the history of the civil rights movement in America, starting with abolition and the Quakers and whatnot. Wherever you want to do, start there and dig deep. Get to know that patch perfectly, and then move on. And of course, a little side note here, since we're on BookTube and since I'm a bit of a freak, my little side note would be, of course, consult me. At any stage in the proceedings, consult me. I'd be happy to cheer you on and help you. And then there's a bonus question, which is to give you some recommendations of nonfiction BookTube channels that you love. And unfortunately, as much BookTube as I watch, I don't have a whole lot of recommendations here because I haven't found a whole lot of channels that even heavily accent nonfiction. Of course, I want to recommend Sharon Goforth. I'll leave links to all these channels down below. And also Peggy Kurkowski, not just because she has a miniature schnauzer, but also because she's got a new channel and she talks regularly about nonfiction. You can look at the books behind her. She clearly loves history and biography. And also my fellow four bookmen of the apocalypse. there's Todd's Bursting Bookcase. There's Jason Harrigan at Byways in Bookland, and there's Mark Richardson at Richardson Reads. The three of them heavily nonfiction. So I recommend all of those channels, and I'll leave links to them down below. But I'm hoping that you can give me recommendations as well. I'm sure there are plenty of channels out there that I'm just not seeing. But anyway, that is the nonfiction on BookTube tag. A kind of an initial thumbprint, a starting point for your nonfiction identity on BookTube. I thought it was a great tag, lots and lots of fun, and I encourage you to do it, especially if you have a nonfiction BookTube channel, a nonfiction predominant BookTube channel. And whether you do it or not, I definitely encourage you to participate in Nonfiction November. Olive has set up all sorts of stuff. There's a Goodreads group. There are Twitter activity. There are prompts and all for Instagram and all sorts of challenges and stuff like that. Just wonderful, wonderful stuff. So it's a full-blown 5-year-old event. Lots of fun to participate in. You'll hear a lot more about Nonfiction November and nonfiction from me in the course of the month, but that's probably enough for now. Sorry for the length of the video, BookTube. So long.